So David, do you want to just do one where it's just you?
Sure.
Okay, so this is take one.
You would probably need to say, "I'm Dave Pietraszewski," right?
It would be weird if you said I'm Dave
Yeah, yeah,
Pietraszewski,
that
but
would
you
be
could
weird.
say we're your hosts, David Pinsof and
Yeah, we're
David.
your host, David. Okay, I can do that.
Yeah,
All right.
so all right, let's see. 321 10987654 321. So take one. David, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dave. We have our first guest today
We
on
do. I'm very
the podcast.
excited.
Yeah, and a very good guest. I think one of the most uh, uh, excellent, top-notch thinkers in the field of evolutionary psychology right now, applying computational and mathematical methodology to mate choice and how we choose our mates. Absolutely fascinating work this guy is doing. We get into all of it. We get into the origin of evolutionary psychology as a lens to understand through which to see human mating. We get into current issues in the study of mate choice and what Dan's criticisms are of some of this research and what his takes are on the various controversies. We cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, and I like this because it's an example of people within EvPsych actually thinking about and characterizing sort of how their own field is going. And Dan has just a great perspective on that. Super fun, super informative, and yeah, enjoy. So, Dan Conroy-Beam, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Dan is a neighbor down the hall and also where we live. And but I actually realized, Dan, in getting ready for this meeting, there's like a lot of questions I've never asked you because we see each other all the time that I never think to ask them. But Dan, you are a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and how long have you been at UC Santa Barbara?
I came here in 2016. So
Okay.
what does that mean? Coming up on
Wow.
9 years.
We should celebrate the 10 years. And before that, you were at Austin
Mhm.
working with David Buss. How did you, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, we can talk about something else immediately, but how did you find David Buss and how did you get interested in EvPsych?
Yeah. You want the long version? You want the short version?
The extra long version, whichever, whatever you want.
All the
Uh,
gory details.
yeah, yeah. Well,
We had we
so
we we did like a really long version of ours, so that was like an
yeah, yeah.
entire episode. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
maybe
like
I've
went into our
oversold.
childhoods. It got
It
really
was a
deep.
therapy. It was a
So
therapy session. No, it really was. Yeah.
So I was born on a snowy day in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. No, it wasn't snowy because it was August. No, yeah, I mean, so I did both my bachelor's and my PhD at the University of Texas, which is where David Buss happens to work, or at least, did by the time I was there. So it was total freak accident luck stuff. Um, I never really had much of an idea of what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't have like a good understanding of what careers existed in the world. Um, I was always really biology was always my favorite subject in school, and I was always like really into just nature and wildlife and just living things. Like as a kid, I would just like that was my thing as a kid, just like drawing different animals. And I had a zoo books subscription. My mom had a zoo books subscription for me. And I just like every month when that zoo books came in and you just had a magazine to learn about like different animals from around the world, that was like Christmas every month.
Mm.
Um, so like I knew that I liked biology, but I didn't really know that like you could be a biologist. And I don't know how it never occurred to me that like there were people whose job it was to generate this information that I was assuming. Uh, Uh, so I like the only job I knew that was like connected to biology was just like something in medicine.
Yeah.
So I just like I was like, I guess I want to do something related to that. I don't really know what. Um, but I remember, I started at UT as an undergrad. I was ostensibly pre-med, but like didn't just because I didn't know what else to be. Um, I took a psych class, fully expecting to hate it, fully expecting like this is gonna be like, you know, Freud laying on couches talking about your mother. It's gonna be stupid. I'm interested in science, I'm not interested in this, but it just like fit my schedule. It like fulfilled the GE. So I was like, I'll just get this. It'll be easy. And it was taught by David Lewis, who was a grad student in David Buss's lab at the time. It was intro psych. It was over the summer actually, and so he had like probably way too much latitude in how he taught the course. So he taught it very much from an evolutionary perspective. Um, and yeah, I did. I just, I remember it was mind blowing. First of all, that psychology is a science that like you can study human thought and emotion and behavior scientifically was a revelation to me. And then also the fact that you could take evolutionary theory, you could take this biological theory, which I had independently already been really interested in. Um, this was like there were a lot of stars that kind
Mm.
of aligned, I guess, maybe to like put me on this exact path because this was, in Texas. This is around the time. I don't know what is the schedule for this. This was around the time where the Texas Public School Board was revising standards for textbooks, which turns out to matter a lot for the whole country because Texas is such a big textbook market that like whatever the Texas public schools decide goes in the textbooks basically dictates what goes in the textbooks for the whole country.
Mm.
And so there was some debate about how are we going to talk about evolution in Texas school textbooks. And so evolution was like very much in the air. There were a lot of like this was a sort of resurgence of the like Scopes monkey trial stuff going on. There was a lot of discussion in Texas about do we teach the controversy or not. And so I was like reading a lot of blogs at the time about like a lot of skeptic blogs about evolutionary theory. I'd like taken a rhetoric class and I wrote it about like evolutionary theory, skepticism on evolutionary theory. Um, and it had always, again, being interested in biology and wildlife, evolution had always been super interesting to me. So the idea that you could take this like embattled scientific theory and apply it to humans and apply it to human behavior, I was like, why? This is so cool. Why didn't someone tell me about this before? Um, I was super into it. I think David noticed I was super into it. Um, and as you do when you're teaching a class, you're always on the lookout for like, good research assistants.
Yeah.
So I think,
It, there's usually like, two or three kids per class who are like really into it and really good students and genuinely curious, and everyone else just wants to get the grade and wants to know whether it's going to be on the test or not, and
yeah,
but
exactly. Yeah.
but you were one of those two or three.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say this is one of the first classes that I can remember being like really intrinsically motivated to do too. Like I
Mhm.
just wanted to imbibe as much of this as possible. And I think, fortunately David just saw that and he's like, I think you should maybe do more of this. Do you want to help me out with my research? So I got involved with David Lewis as a research assistant for him. Um, and just really enjoyed doing that. Spent a lot of my free time in the lab helping DL with all kinds of things. As you do, starting with like grunt work, running participants, doing literature reviews. But I think he just kept seeing that I kept being really interested in it and really invested in it. He kept giving me more and more to do. Um, and then another star that aligned was UT at the time had this, I think it maybe still exists, but had this program for sort of getting undergraduates more connected in research. Um, kind of, we have similar programs at UCSB, I guess, but it was unusually well funded. So DL and I signed up for this. It was like a mentorship program. And one of the perks was they funded the student to go to an academic conference. So after my freshman year of college, I got money to fly out to HBES in Fullerton.
Mm.
So that HBES was my very first academic conference. I had no idea what an academic conference was like. Um, Flew out there, um, attended that HBES, and that was like that. I remember especially. It was just a mind blowing experience, right? Like just whole conference halls full of people who are exactly as obsessed with this topic as I am, and you just get to sit there for 3 days, 9 to 5, and just hear about all the cool cutting edge science that like everybody, all these people are doing. You get to hear about these like discoveries before anyone else. You're just like drowning in this like really cool topic for days. It was so exhilarating. It was so fun. It was so fun to meet a bunch of people. Um, and so I think that was like a real turning point. That was like, okay, like there's a career here. I really enjoy doing this. Like I want to keep coming to this conference as much as I can. So yeah, at that point I was like dead set on being an evolutionary psychologist. Um, and I was already in the bus lab. I was already like learning about evolutionary psychology, primarily from David Lewis, but I took David Buss's classes after that. I took as many classes as I could at UT that sort of like cobbled together like an EvPsych degree as much as I could. I switched majors immediately. I switched in this like program as soon as I could. But I minored in biology and I took as many like bio stats psych courses to like cobble together as much of an EvPsych degree as I could. Um, it's probably not an accident that I fell into human mating being in the bus lab. I mean, I may have fallen into it anyway, but that just seemed like the natural topic to study. And then, ended up staying there for grad school, not necessarily intentionally, but that's just what ended up happening. And yeah, now I'm here.
Does anybody, when anybody ever interviews you, 'cause I've seen you in several interviews, does anybody ever ask you how you got interested in mating, or is that sort of a
Yeah, it's maybe a given.
right?
I don't know. No, yeah, I don't know if that question has ever really come up. How did you guys avoid getting interested in mating?
Well, for a while, till I turned 10 or something.
Yeah,
I
I don't
don't.
know that I was ever not interested. It's sort of an intrinsically interesting topic. Anything related to sex or death is sort of innately interesting to us, I think.
Hmm.
And I think
Um,
for me, oh, David, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
no, no, go
I was
ahead.
just,
Yeah.
for me, like, I think as a lot of people, like mating was especially like sort of a gateway drug for EvPsych too, where it
Hmm.
was sort of, as a 17, 18, 19-year-old, whatever, you're like, whoa, a science of this. Because that was one of the other things that I found a bit disappointing about psychology, as interested as I was, is that the topics were sort of reasoning, problem solving. And I was like, well, what about like jealousy or anger or mating, or love or something like that? And so for me, that was like definitely exciting. So yeah.
Yeah. No, for me, I think, I mean, I do think mating, and I do try to keep up in developments in mating psychology, as much as I can. For me, it wasn't that it didn't make sense or it wasn't insightful and interesting. It was almost that it made too much sense and it was too insightful. Like,
Yeah.
like I'm like, oh, I totally buy this. This makes so much sense. I love the connections with other animals, but like I want to move on to the more mysterious things,
Mm.
like what's going on with, ideologies and sacred values, like this weird stuff that's totally mysterious. I wanted to be more ambitious and like tackle something that was really confusing. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's
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 just my
right.
personality, I guess.
You don't open the behavioral theology textbook and see like political ideologies in the gazelles or red stag deer or
Right,
something.
exactly.
It depends on what book you open. I don't know. If you're reading Funds of All, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, for the mating literature, Dan, is there do you think that like it's been going on long enough that you could characterize sort of what its trajectory has been, or like where do you think the mating um, stuff is at, or maybe even like more broadly, like of psych. We talked a little bit about people thinking of psych as just a just so story. We talked a little bit about making design or software level claims. We haven't really talked about like evolutionary game theory, and I assume that the audience of this will be a combination of just sort of people who know a lot, maybe people who don't know a lot. One of the things I really like about your work um, is that you're bringing these different tools to bear, and I'm wondering like things like modeling or game theory or selection pressure dynamics. Um, could you talk a little bit either about like how you see those affecting the way we study things in EP or mating more specifically?
That's two really big, really
Yeah,
good questions. Um, you know, it's going to be hard to characterize the trajectory of mating research in a way that's not like totally self-serving. I mean,
please be self-serving, Dan. Please.
I mean, I can tell you sort of. Uh, Let me answer it this way, maybe to excuse how self-serving it's going to necessarily be. Like, I can tell you how a direction I see that the work needs to go in, a gap that I try to fill. Let me
Right.
put it
Yeah,
that
yeah.
way.
We can do let a thousand flowers bloom, but what's the flowers that you think a couple that you would like to pursue? Yeah.
Uh, so I think there's like I don't know. There's maybe like a couple phases I can see dividing the history of like human mating research into, perhaps. Um, I think obviously human mating is at the core of it, what evolutionary psychology is, right? Like I think Don Simon's Evolution of Human Sexuality, you could consider the first EvPsych text, depending on how you want to, you know.
I would argue that the Descent of Man by Darwin is the first
Yeah, yeah.
EvPsych text, but even that is also full of mating
It's true.
stuff.
It's true.
Okay.
It's true.
Yeah, that's
Critique of pure reason. I got you guys beat now.
I, obviously strains of these ideas have been present in lots of places for a lot of times, but I feel like the first time sort of modern adaptationist evolutionary psychology cohered in a single place, I would unselfishly call
Mhm.
Evolution of Human Sexuality.
That's fair.
Um,
Was that before or after Adapted Mind?
it was about 10 years before
Yeah,
Adaptive
that
Mind
was
was.
Oh, really?
78 or 79, I
Yeah.
Oh,
believe.
wow. Okay.
Oh yeah.
All right. Then you are correct. That is the oldest.
And Dawn,
Fantastic book. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it is great.
Dawn was instrumental in getting John and Lena here, and I think the sort of UCSB, you know, uh, collective, I think really sort of like forged this discipline out of their collection of interests. Um, so I think that book was obviously a turning point, and that really inspired people like Margot Wilson and Martin Daly. It also really inspired people like David Buss. So I think there's like that sort of first phase in between Don and David, where like the field was kind of coming together, and sort of basic like evolutionary. Don was really sketching out like what are the basic evolutionary principles and what are the basic facts of human evolution and human life history as we understand them at the time that are relevant for making predictions about human psychology in the domain of human mating. And I think David Buss, a lot of people picked up and ran with that, but David Buss really like established a particular brand that was very empirically successful and very popular. And so I think that maybe starts a kind of second phase of human mating research, which we may or may not still be in.
Mm.
Because David, a lot of people don't know this, but David was trained originally as a personality psychologist. He was not, obviously he wasn't trained as an evolutionary psychologist because there was no possible way to get trained as an evolutionary psychologist at that time. So he was trained as a personality psychologist, and his innovation, he got famous originally for personality work. Like he got a job at Harvard on his personality stuff, and was really famous for developing this, act nomination procedure for mapping what a personality construct is, right? Rather than looking at the dictionary and having people rate all the words in a dictionary that describe a person and, deriving your measures through factor analysis of dictionary terms. He just said, let's go to people and just ask them, what are the things that an extroverted person does? And let's define the construct in terms of this like collection of behaviors that people associate with this. Um, so he was already very used to developing scales and measures. Um, he's used to doing these like large scale survey projects, and he was interested in these evolutionary approaches that were emerging. He met Lita and John. He was a faculty member when Lita and John were like undergrads at Harvard, right? And they tell the story of like going to David's office as he was like just starting to write about this evolution stuff and telling him he was doing everything wrong.
I once asked Lita what she said to David Buss during that, and I forgot what she said. We'll have to have Lita on.
um,
It
so
sounded like it was very polite, actually. In the end, it sounded much worse, more salacious than it might have been. Yeah,
well, you should maybe ask David for his version.
that's true. Fair enough. Yeah.
They may not have the same version. I don't
Mm.
remember. Um, so I think there was some exchange of ideas there. Um, so David, I think, took this sort of very, measuring latent constructs sort of approach from personality psychology and sort of brought this together with, the evolutionary insights that Don Simons was bringing. So he's saying, okay, if we think drawing from sexual selection theory, there's reason to expect, humans have these preferences, but some of them may be sex differentiated for these particular, evolutionary historic reasons. Let's develop a questionnaire to measure preferences and see, do we see the kinds of patterns one would expect, that, what kinds of things are popular, but most importantly, what sort of sex differences are there? Because that's going to be, David's motivation at the time also, we have to remember this, is applying evolutionary theory to human behavior was extremely controversial. And this is coming after the like sociobiology wars, which, David, Lita, and John were all exposed to firsthand at Harvard. Right. So I think in David's mind, I don't know, I don't want to speak to him too much. This is me sort of piecing together maybe a history, but you'd have to ask him. But I imagine part of, just from knowing David and knowing the history, I imagine a big part of his goal here is not necessarily to map mating psychology per se, as much as to like provide a proof of concept, validate evolutionary approaches in the first place against all of this controversy. So I think, he gets a lot of flack for focusing a lot on sex differences and overemphasizing sex differences. And that's, I think, where this sort of, I'll get into that, but I think that's, what ends up defining this kind of phase of mating research. But I think that's because sex differences were like a really natural lever, right? Like if you want to prove to the world, show the world that like there's some value in this evolutionary theory stuff, this can make really strong predictions that no one else can. That you need this evolutionary theory stuff to do your psychology. Sex differences are a really easy, natural place to start. And so that's where he started, right? So that's where like Bus 89 comes from, is evolutionary theory makes this really clear prediction that no other existing social psychological theories of preferences make, which is there should be these cross-culturally invariant sex differences on certain dimensions. So he took his personality psych know-how and, he actually borrowed, I think a lot of people don't know this as well, his first preference questionnaire. He didn't come up with it. He actually just took it from a paper, Hill 1945 or something like that. So it was a preference questionnaire that, had been in use in the US at that time for some amount of use for 50 years. He basically just took Hill's questionnaire and administered it around the world with maybe some slight modifications. I don't remember. And yeah, established that there are these cross-culturally universal sex differences, at least among, 37 relatively industrialized cultures.
It's interesting, just reflecting on the history of evolutionary psychology. And, you make a very good point that if you want to start somewhere in applying evolution to human behavior and human psychology, sex differences makes the most sense. You
Mhm.
know, the predictions there are the clearest. You see parallels in other animal species. There are really large effect sizes to be found there. You can do interesting cross-cultural work. It's a really meaty, good place to start if you want to just prove to the world that, hey, this perspective works. It makes predictions and discoveries. The findings are solid. Look at what this field can do. But I can also imagine a downside to that, and that not only is, the sex differences, it's the easiest place to start, but it's also the most controversial and provocative and inflammatory place you could possibly start. And so I'm imagining, like, what would evolutionary psychology be in the parallel universe where it didn't start with sex differences and it started with something else? Would the field be completely different today? And I think there's a good case to be made that it probably would be very different. That starting with this, inflammatory issue of sex differences sort of stamped the field with this controversial edgelord reputation. And it attracted all of these people who wanted to be edgelords and wanted to study controversial things and study titillating topics. And it sort of provided this inertia for the field that in many ways is probably not a good thing. Yes, the predictions there are solid, the findings are solid, but I really wonder what evolutionary psychology would have been like if it started somewhere else. Say if it started with like group psychology, the stuff that Dave studies, or something else. I'm curious what your reaction to that is in terms of just the historical inertia of the field.
Think that's exactly exactly right. And I think that's not to criticize David or anything, right? I think his work is great, and I think he's done. No one can um, no one can deny David's like service to the field
We're
and
talking David. We have
David
three
Buss.
Davids,
Yes, true, true.
three
It's really
Davids orbiting
confusing.
this
I think this
conversation.
is true of all David, both Davids here as well as David Buss.
All of my
Uh,
work on mating has been really important since the 80s when
yes, yeah,
I was a some year old, single digit year old. Yeah.
it's true. I should be careful. But yeah, no one can deny David Buss's service to the field, and he's done more than nearly anyone to like put the field on the map. But I do think there have been downsides to the particular approach that he chose, and I think um, there's several sort of founders of the field that you could identify, right? If we're talking about capital E, capital P, evolutionary psychology per se, and not just all approaches to evolution behavior, I think of like Leda Cosmides, John Tooby, kind of together, Steve Pinker, Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, the people in that picture, right? David Buss, Don Simons, and I think they had sort of different approaches to this, and you can sort of see the lineage of their work because yeah, David Buss has never been one to shy away from controversy. That's for sure. And I don't think he's quite edge lord. There
No,
are
he's
some
he's a
people.
very lovely man. He definitely does not have this reputation. We
I
should
think
we
he
should.
has that reputation.
Oh, I mean, oh, no, no, no,
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
He
Is it earned?
no, he hasn't earned it. Yes,
Yeah,
is the
yeah,
point. Yeah.
yeah. There are certainly some people who relish in controversy. David does not,
Mhm.
but David
Yeah.
does not shy away from it either. Um,
Mhm.
and he's actually, yeah, I think he's a very savvy guy. He wouldn't be where he
Mhm.
was if he wasn't, good at navigating these kinds of topics. But I think, like Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, they did kind of go the route that you were talking about, right? Like
Yeah.
they wanted to prove evolutionary psychology as a useful discipline. And so they did go to something very, pretty uncontroversial, very
Mhm.
like cooperation, right? It's very heartwarming, very
Mhm.
positive, and they try to demonstrate that you can make useful predictions in this area that should be something that we can all agree is a good thing and people should be minimally angry about. I don't know. What's your sense, Dave, as a student of theirs? Like, you know, I see David, he started at Harvard, so that probably helped him. So did they, but he was like faculty at Harvard already. I think he was able to parlay that into a position at Michigan, maybe still riding off the personality fame. Like David had a massive advantage in already being a very successful personality psychologist. So he was able to do this very controversial stuff, just like using the last of his personality psych credit, like just burning all of that. And then he just got lucky that this F psych stuff took off in time before people hated him basically for doing that sort of stuff. Um, I don't know that Lita and John have obviously been extremely successful and extremely influential, like in the long game played out, but I don't know that they had the like immediate success that David had for going with something that was more salacious and controversial.
Yeah, I mean, I think the group or the cooperation thing, and I don't know this for sure, but I think the cooperation thing, you're right, is not as salacious immediately, and it's sort of warm and fuzzy. My understanding of what I do know is, and what Lita has said, is that I don't know the how strategic using cooperation was. What I do know was what was strategic, and this is sort of not along the salacious dimension, but along the scientific dimension, which is I love about John and Lita, is they're thinking, well, reasoning is a bastion of sort of unitary assumptions, right? Like what I love about John and Lita's work was it was an articulation of the assumptions that were such deep assumptions that they weren't even treated as assumptions, right? Like I think that's what I really love about the work, and so it was strategic to say reasoning is something we're going to go after and say, look, this idea that reasoning is content independent, a unitary thing that an evolutionary approach doesn't help you for thinking about reasoning, we're going to go after that. And so I think I think that was the idea. And then after there was an acceptance of that, people would say something like, well, like, but emotions, aren't gonna, so it was just sort of following the, and what about this? What about that? And sort of following that. So I believe that was their strategy. So I think it was really at the level of the scientific claims and not about the reactions of people per se.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, um, so to your point, David, I think you've described a lot of the history exactly right. Unfortunately,
Hmm.
I think the sex differences stuff that 1989 behavioral and brain sciences paper that was huge. That was
Yeah.
that was a big paper in psychology period, and that really planted a flag for this like
Hmm.
evolutionary psychology stuff. From there, David went on to he picked up some ideas again that trace themselves to Don Simons through Martin Daly and Margot Wilson on jealousy. Again, looking at sex differences and jealousy as a really natural prediction, just showing
Hmm.
we can make a prediction that no one else can, and we can
Hmm.
validate this around the world. And then, Bussenschmidt 93, he went to mating strategy. Again, it's sort of picking up, there's this like intuitive kind of dimension along which mating relationships vary between, they called it short term, long term at the time, these
Hmm.
sort of like high commitment monogamous romantic relationships, which seem to be somewhat human unique, versus these sort of like short term uncommitted sexual relationships. And David just like sicked his personality psychology training on that, and developed some measures and made a bunch of sex difference predictions about how these things should be sex differentiated, drawing on ideas going back again to Simons. So that sort of set up this like holy trinity of mating research, right? Like jealousy, preferences, mating strategy. Those are like
Hmm.
big three constructs in mating psychology because of David Buss's early work. And, a huge amount of mating psychology research following that has been basically like pick one of those three or any combination therein, and then either, show some kind of sex difference in it,
Hmm.
riff on it a little bit, like, we want to demonstrate a sex difference in mating strategy either through people's attitudes or through people's behaviors or the kinds of things that they regret doing post hoc, right? Just like show, come up with a new way to demonstrate the same sex difference in the same dimension, but yeah, either in a new context or a new cultural context or with some kind of new measure. And so much of the mating research for the last, what has it been, 30 years has been just sort of rehashing through those same three constructs,
Hmm.
again, show a sex difference in some kind of slightly novel way that David Buss didn't technically already show in 1990. And I think that's been bad. I mean, that has generated a lot of knowledge, has generated like a really robust foundation for human mating psychology research, which I'm grateful for. Um, but I think, my opinion is we've done it. We've exhausted.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
we know that now. We don't need any more papers on sex differences and mate preferences, despite being a person who's published some of those recently. I mean, it is like a nice. You can. There's always money in the banana stand, right? Like you can always get another paper on sex differences and mate preferences if you just need something. Um, uh, but yeah, I think that stuff has attracted a lot of people who, yeah, are not necessarily as interested in the science as they are in pissing people off. And I think
Mhm.
that kind of work is just always easy to do.
Right.
And it's just it was so influential, it was so valuable that sex differences have kind of come to like dominate um to dominate the literature to the point
Yeah.
where I think we've
Or at the very least, the public perception of the field. I don't know if it necessarily, has a disproportionate number of researchers working on the topic. Maybe it does. But even beyond that, just the public perception of it, I feel like, is dominated by the sex differences research, even more than perhaps exists in reality.
I think the public perception's about right. Uh,
Really? You think so?
I think there's people out there who are not doing sex differences research.
Yeah.
I think that's true. Um, but I think a lot of the you know a lot of the human mating research has been studying sex differences in psychology. I think to the exclusion of studying the psychology itself.
Yeah.
So that's what I would like to see as like a third phase of human mating research, like just getting back to I the way I think of it is while Lita and John were playing this long game of like,
Hmm.
you know, how do you really carefully, yeah, systematically pick a topic and just really systematically map the information processing design of that psychology, really systematically map the design of cooperation psychology, of emotion psychology, of group psychology. That maybe doesn't get like as big of headlines as like, new universal sex difference, men are men are, you know, new research finds that men are all hussies and women are all chaste or whatever. That'll get you like fun headlines, but it doesn't really tell you that much about how the psychology works. And I think human mating research maybe needs to get more back into that. Yeah, like let's return to some of the more Don Simonsy approach to of like let's be really clear eyed about what are the adaptive problems that
Hmm.
humans would have recurrently faced in human mating in the mating domain, and especially like, yeah, I just feel like the old guard I think get very defensive about this kind of thing. But sex differences are important, don't get me wrong. Again, I've published sex differences papers, I don't know, recent within the last couple of years, probably, I can't remember. um but I feel like a 5-year moratorium on sex differences papers would just like help the field. Like
Totally.
not ban it forever, but just like force people to be a little creative in finding other things to study.
Right. I mean, the downside of the complexity of the human mind and of human nature is that when you pick one part of it, it's easy to get carried away and think that that part of it represents the whole,
Mhm.
right? Like, yes, we can all agree men and women are different. They have faced different selection pressures throughout our evolutionary history. We can make specific predictions about how they're going to be different, and we can, see parallels between those differences and the differences you see in other species facing similar selection pressures. Yes, agreed. But there's a huge but. There's so much more to the story than
Mhm.
that simple starting point, right? Yes, men and women are different and they have different mating strategies, etc. But they are also more similar to one another relative to other animals than, many animals in the animal kingdom. The degree of paternal investment in offspring is way higher in humans than you see in many other animals. We without a doubt have a pair bonding psychology. We without a doubt have substantial similarities between men and women in that pair bonding psychology, and the sophistication with which we look for mates, with which we maintain relationships, look for alternative relationships, etc., is mind-boggling. So there's just so much more to the story. Once you have this foundation, it's a good foundation to have. It's a good starting point. But yes, we need to move beyond this starting point and drill into the complexity of what is going on with human mating psychology beyond, male female sexual psychology.
Yeah, agreed completely. And
Yeah.
there's also, you throw in the sort of like perverse incentives of academia where, to get a job, to get tenure, you need a sort of baseline level of productivity. You need to be getting papers out the door on a pretty regular basis. And so I don't blame people, right? Like if you're a young human mating researcher, you need a certain number of papers to stay alive or make it to the next stage. Like, what are
Yeah.
you going to do? Are you going to pick the easy topic that is going to result in some kind of finding that someone is going to publish somewhere? Or are you going to go on a limb and, try to make a bold hypothesis about how something works that may or may not pan out? So, it's a sex differences is the safe pick.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, you seem to have escaped the gravitational pull of this process, at least in your research on, mate preference integration, desirability covariation. This stuff is not sex differentiated, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. The mate preference integration, exists in both men and women. We have these wide variety of things that we're looking for in a partner, whether it be looks, kindness, shared culture, intelligence, whatever. We have all of these desired preferences. The mind needs some way to integrate them. And what you're after is how does it integrate them? It's actually a really tough question to answer. It's not obvious what the solution is. There are many candidate ways that the mind can integrate these preferences. So this is a clear aspect of our mating psychology that does not appear to have strong sex differentiation. It's deeply computational. You cannot study this problem except in computational terms. How to integrate different preferences, like I don't see an alternative way of thinking about that topic. So it's intrinsically computational, intrinsically non-sex differentiated, and you went in this direction, and you are successful. You're at Santa Barbara, professor, almost 10 years now. How did you escape the gravitational pull?
well, I don't know that I fully escaped it because
Yeah.
along the way I've been publishing sex differences stuff too, right?
Mhm.
So my first paper was on sex differences and preferences. We had a big replication paper in 2016. So it has been that has been old reliable for me too, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, but yeah, we've been doing that on the side of some more risky stuff that has kind of just happened to pan out.
Mhm.
um, which is a strategy I would recommend to my students, and I try to advise them through. So I mean, where that stuff comes from is, yeah, this is the self-serving part, like what I would sincerely hope ends up becoming kind of like a third phase of human mating research, um, which is like this is a good example of why focusing so much on sex differences really hurt us, because there was this 20, 30 years of research on mate preferences, which is basically take a questionnaire that asks people, what do you want your ideal partner to look like? They just say, I want them to have these features. I don't want them to have those features. And then, you show there's a sex difference in, how people respond to some of those questions. You write the paper, you send it off, you call it a day. And people were doing that for 20, 30 years. And people kind of forgot to ask, do those preferences actually get reflected in behavior? Like when you look at the partners people actually choose, do they really pursue those things? And they didn't entirely forget to do that. I mean, so there were some studies that tried to get at that with like hypothetical choice paradigms. Here's like two profiles. Which profile do you choose? Or they would look at things like personals ads. Do you see these sex differences reflected in the kinds of personals ads people post or respond to? David Buss had looked at a little bit at, do people's actual chosen partners reflect the things that they say that they want? Although, there's all kinds of methodological problems with that. You don't necessarily know, just because your partner matches your preferences, you don't know necessarily that's because your preferences caused that choice versus you said you wanted those things because your partner had them. So
Mhm.
there had been like a little bit of work throughout the years, just sort of like but it was sort of seen as just like a validation of the preferences. It wasn't seen as like a research topic in and of itself. Like, can we actually predict people's behavior on the basis of these abstract preferences they say they have? So that people were so interested in the sex differences, they just kind of forgot about that more basic question until about the mid 2000s. There happened to be like a series of papers from, as far as I'm aware, totally disconnected research groups that all used the same methodology to test this question. There was, Peter Todd and colleagues in Germany. There's Rob Kurzban, and then there was Paul Eastwick. Um, all around the same time, had the same thought: we can use speed dating, which was like, a popular new invention at the time, newish invention at the time. We can use speed dating as like a natural experiment to test, do people actually choose the partners that they say they want on these abstract preference questionnaires? So they would administer the same kinds of questionnaires that people are using for this preference research just before a speed dating event. So they'd have, either they would arrange one or they would work with a company. You'd have 10 to 20 people who all showed up, single people interested in being in a relationship. They all talk to each other in little 5 to 10 minute sessions. And then afterwards, they just say, do you want to go on a date with that person? Yes or no? And it's a perfect little, in theory, it's a perfect little mating experiment, right? You can see really quickly a lot of decisions that one person makes, and you can see, do they actually say, yes, I want to date the person who has the features I just said I wanted on that abstract preference questionnaire? And from those initial studies, the answer seemed to be no. That people were not, by and large, knowing what a person's preferences were before that speed dating event did not give you a lot of statistical power to predict the people they actually said yes to in that event. And that was kind of that was a big moment in mating research too. Like that is perplexing, right?
Yes.
And people took that in a lot of different directions, right? So I think the sort of Kurzban interpretation was something between, maybe you're not quite getting to know this person enough. Maybe speed dating is activating more of a short-term mating context, and so your long-term preferences don't apply. I think at one point he speculated maybe, and he did have some evidence for this, like maybe there are these sort of consensual preferences that matter, but these individual differences in preferences, maybe that's just noise. And you would see that, like, if you stratify the speed dating events by, for example, like age or professional status, you would see, people went to the speed dating events that sort of catered to their general desires. But then within those events, you couldn't necessarily predict the specific person each person chose. So maybe there's some sort of like general preference for age or something like that. But like your age specifically doesn't
is the
matter.
idea there that it's not that mate preferences don't matter, it's that the ones that matter are a part of human nature and a part of human mating psychology, and the ones that individuals vary on, at least as we can judge based on their questionnaire responses, those don't matter. But that isn't to say that preferences in general don't matter.
That's one interpretation.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that Kurzban kind of floated. I don't know if that's fair. He would disagree with whatever I say because he's Kurzban. But that's maybe one read I would put into his interpretation. The Todd and colleagues interpretation was, there is a preference in there somewhere that matters, but it's not what people are able to verbalize. Whatever people are verbalizing, that's just some sort of like weird, ad hoc, like folk theory of what they want.
Right. So it's not the preferences don't matter, it's that we're measuring them the wrong way. The measurements suck. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the Eastwick interpretation was that preferences don't matter.
Got it.
People don't know what they want. And he's really like come to a point where like he's really kind of arguing that like attraction might be fundamentally unpredictable. And he would argue he also has kind of come around. I don't think he sees it this way, but I see it as him coming around to the sort of Kurzbanian view, where he argues like in order to show that a preference matters, you need to show that the individual differences in preferences matter. So you need to show that like because you value age more than I do, because you value older partners more than I do, you choose older partners more often than I do. But if you show that like the average preference for older partners, if you show that on average people have a preference for older partners, like he would count that as there not being a preference, which I think is bizarre. Because yeah, when
Yeah,
you think
Hmm.
that's
about
weird.
how
How
we
do you get
measure,
that? Yeah, how would you get there otherwise?
uh, yeah, I think if you show that humans in general tend to choose older partners, you have shown that humans have a preference for older partners, and that's
Hmm.
how we measure preferences in non-human animals, right? We show that
Right.
peacocks in general prefer peacocks with more elaborate tails, right? And
Yeah,
we more
yeah.
elaborate trains.
I mean, my intuition just hearing this is maybe I'm wrong. You can correct me if I'm wrong. The most plausible one to me is just the measurements suck. That like, yeah, I would obviously expect preferences to matter in shaping behavior, but I don't think I know what my preferences are deep down. I don't think most people have access to that information. At least in any straightforward sense. I when I'm attracted to someone, I know it when I see it, but I don't know that I can articulate what it is about that person that drew me to them. And maybe people just don't have conscious access to this.
Or if you do, like it's a restricted range thing too. It sounds like that was
Mhm.
Yeah.
the other thing. So like, people there are studies of people arguing, well, look, like using drugs doesn't affect life outcomes because their sample was college students.
Mhm.
And that's a restricted range issue, right?
Yeah.
It's a biased sample of everybody is high functioning enough to be in college. But if you looked
Yeah.
across from homeless people to successful people and you looked at drug use, you would find a different result. So yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah. And
Yeah.
normally has made that argument in the context of the speed dating stuff, right? Like especially in these like speed dating studies of college students, which a lot of these are, yeah, it's not a random sample of humanity that's showing up to these speed dating events. It's
Yes.
again, especially for these college students, it's mostly other young, relatively wealthy, relatively successful college students that you're picking among. And so yeah, there's just not a lot of restriction of range. So he did a study where they literally like they intentionally tried to expand the range of people in the speed dating events beyond just college students. Like they literally like intentionally went out and recruited like gas station attendants to participate alongside the college students. And they did find evidence in that case that preferences were more predictive when you increase the types of people who are showing up to these events. Um,
Mm.
but the point is, this was a huge uh, puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think now there's now a good handful of people who have been weighing in on this sort of emerging debate on what actually predicts people's mate choice behavior and why do these speed dating studies come out the way that they do.
Hmm.
And I don't think a clear consensus. I have my opinions, but I don't think a clear consensus has emerged, and it's been really exciting. And
Hmm.
this is a much again as much as I value obviously like I got into evolutionary psychology because of that sort of like second phase 90s era mating research. But I think this has been a much more interesting and productive direction than maybe what was happening in a lot of the like early 2000s. And what it like, I think the field has like come to a point where, yeah, we can now be asking serious questions about how does the psychology of human mating work? How does it work?
Hmm.
And what sorts of predictions can we actually make? For my part, I think there's a lot of things going on. I think speed dating just sucks as
Hmm.
a institution. I mean, there is some evidence that people do form relationships in speed dating events, so I don't think it's like totally worthless. But yeah, it's a really, really brief exposure to a person. I think when saying yes
Yeah.
or no to someone at the end of a speed date is not really a mate choice. It's just like, yeah, I'd be willing to talk to that person more.
Right.
Um, and it's probably you're getting a pretty noisy snapshot of what that person is like, and you're making a pretty low commitment bid.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that we should expect preferences to predict those choices all that much.
Sure. And especially, if you think from an evolutionary perspective, this is such an artificial
Yeah,
context. Throughout our evolutionary history, we almost certainly would have had tons of exposure to a person before attempting to form a romantic relationship with them. So this is just such a weird artificial context to study mating.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And this, by the way, is how I got into this work, right? So
Hmm.
I was interested in human mating. I was in grad school. I was thinking about doing totally different stuff. And then all these papers came out. Paul Eastwick was at UT at the time. So I was having, face-to-face interactions with him when he was saying, you know, these preferences don't matter. I also think, like, to be honest, I think there's a bit of mm, uh, there's a bit of ideology here,
Hmm.
um, in that I think some of the people, I won't name names, but some of the people who are highly invested in this debate, I think they're very excited about these findings, especially these speed dating findings, where preferences don't seem to predict choice very well because they have this sort of ideological opposition to evolutionary psychology as a discipline. And
Mm.
mate preferences have been, one of the key success stories of evolutionary psychology. So if you're able to show that these preferences don't predict choices, well, that disproves evolutionary psychology, right? That takes a lot of the wind out of our sails. That undoes one of our major success stories. So I think there are people who are highly invested in demonstrating that preferences don't predict choice just because they want to undermine evolutionary psychology as a field.
Mhm.
And I think that partly got me interested in this just because I was like annoyed as a partisan,
Yeah.
annoyed at these people trying to like take a pot shot at our field. Um, and I also think it's just kind of like it is an annoying, just kind of crappy rhetorical position because if you want to find a null result, it's not that hard to do, right?
Yeah.
Arguing for the null is a really weak rhetorical position, but I think just because evolutionary psychology is controversial enough for reasons that we've earned in many ways,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people who are willing to tolerate kind of crappy arguments and crappy data in the service of undermining this unlikable field.
It's such a bizarre way to gratify yourself intellectually because if that's correct, that the most biologically important decision we can make throughout our entire lifetimes is essentially random. If that's correct, that not only demolishes evolutionary psychology, that demolishes evolutionary theory, sexual selection, modern biology as we know it. Like that is devastating to our understanding of reality itself. That is not something to celebrate. That is something to say like, holy shit, we really need to think twice before we advance this position. Like, shouldn't we be trying to evaluate the plausibility of our hypotheses in light of how consistent they are with existing knowledge, before we go out and argue for them, right? Like, it should have basic evolutionary plausibility, basic consistency with everything we know about how the world works.
I think the fact that you find that natural is probably why you're an evolutionary psychologist,
Yeah.
a social psychologist. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the people who feel this way probably don't see it that way. I think they see it as like, I don't know what they think. I can't get into their heads because I'm not them. But I think they probably see it as like evolutionary theory is still fine, but we're humans, right? We're smarter.
Yeah,
We have free will and
sure.
consciousness, and so we're
Yeah.
freed from our genetic puppet strings.
Yeah,
And
it's so
so,
dumb.
yeah.
So I mean, so we have this really interesting result, which is that preferences don't appear to matter, at least when you measure them in speed dating contexts and you ask people on questionnaires what they're looking for in a partner. We floated a number of solutions to the puzzle. Maybe the measurements suck. Maybe speed dating is weird. Maybe preferences don't actually matter, and we're just picking at random when it comes to our most biologically important decision we can make. Or maybe it's human nature that matters, but individual variation doesn't matter as much. Maybe there are unseen forces at play. Maybe we don't have conscious awareness of our mate preferences. Out of all of these different possibilities, all these different buckets, where are you putting your vote in? What do you think is the most likely solution to this puzzle, if there is one?
I think there's a bit of a lot of things going on. I think speed dating just sucks.
Yeah,
And I think you can partly see that there are other study designs. So, there's been a couple of nice longitudinal papers that have come out in the last couple of years. For example, from like Tanya Gerlach's group, Lars Penka's group, where, you measure someone's preferences when they're single. One of them actually comes out of one of these speed dating studies. They managed to go back like 15 years after one of these speed dating studies, get the original speed daters, follow up with them, and then ask them, well, who are you with now? And they were able to use their preferences from that speed dating study 15 years ago and
Hmm.
use that to try to predict, who did they end up with 15 years later.
Interesting. Wow.
And they do predict,
Yeah.
right? So
Wow. Okay.
yeah, it's
That's
not,
cool.
it's not huge, but there is a
Yeah.
significant correlation between what you
Okay.
said you were looking for in a partner. Maybe I'm forgetting the details, but it's something like 15 years ago and who you're
Hmm.
actually with now. And you can do that. They've also done that on like a shorter time scale, like a 3 month time period. I ask you what you're looking for now. When you're single, come back with you 3 months later. And your preferences from 3 months ago predict what your partner is like now. We haven't published this yet, but Dave knows. My student Carlos has just replicated this So preferences can predict future choices when you are looking at, and Lorne Campbell has a similar paper, when you're looking at sort of naturalistic real world choices that are not, you met this person for 5 minutes, do you want to see them again? It's an actual real world make choice out, in free ranging humans.
Hmm.
Their response to these preference questionnaires do predict what their later partners look like. I think a lot of the measurement in these speed dating studies just sucks. This is, again, I think, an artifact of being so focused on sex differences. And also, I think, honestly, coming out of this personality psych tradition where, you know, you're only ever thinking about abstract latent variables, but you're not necessarily thinking about, like, what does that latent variable mean in terms of an information processing variable in the mind. So people have been studying preferences for a really long time, but have been really unclear on what a preference is supposed to be. And the result of that is, if you look at the way people measure preferences across the literature, it's super heterogeneous. So some people, two different people will say they're studying the same thing. They'll say they're doing the same, they're replicating the same measure or methodology. But if you look at how are you measuring preferences, in one case, it'll be something like, well, how important, and a lot of the speed dating studies do this. They'll ask the participants, how important is physical attractiveness to you in a partner, 1 to 10? And then they'll ask, how physically attractive is this partner, 1 to 10? And then they'll ask, does your answer to that importance question predict the physical attractiveness of the person that you chose? And that, it feels kind of reasonable if you don't think about it too hard. But
Hmm.
asking how important physical attractiveness is to you is not the same as asking how important or how attractive you want your partner to be. It could be
Yes.
very important to you that your partner is unattractive, right? Those are
Yes.
distinct things.
Or it could just be that it's very important to me that my partner isn't a total uggo.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
once they're not a total uggo, like anything's fine, right?
yeah, yeah. So there's lots of like implicit models of
Yeah.
preference that,
Yeah.
that you could have that different people seem to have that aren't translated out clearly to the measures. And so a lot of these papers are saying, like, we're finding that preferences aren't measuring choice. But then you look at, well, how did you measure preferences? How did you measure choice? And it's all over the place. And
Yeah.
it's not really like a theoretically motivated, what should we expect the preference to look like? And how should we expect that to lead out to a choice?
Hmm.
So I think if you clean up the measurement a little bit, things look clearer. And then this is also how I got into that preference integration stuff, right? There's a major issue here too, in that a lot of this work is strictly univariate. So it's looking at,
Yes.
what is your physical attractiveness preference? How attractive is the person that you chose, right?
Yes.
But we know people have more than just one preference, right? Especially when you're looking
Yes.
at like a speed dating event. The most
Right.
attractive person, you only talk to 10 people. The most attractive person you talk to might have been a total asshole, right? They might have been
Right.
an idiot.
And you can only pick one person at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
one person does not have one trait; they have many traits,
Yeah.
yeah,
and
This
you
is
have to
yeah.
make a
yeah.
balancing consideration of all of their traits together. Do I like this whole bundle of traits uh, enough for me to mate with this person? It's not just, oh, they meet my attractiveness threshold, therefore I will mate with them. It's no, this person is a hugely complicated entity with all sorts of traits and costs and benefits. How am I going to evaluate this complicated a bundle of costs and benefits, and that's what you're interested in.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, my argument has been, if you consider that sort of balancing act that people are doing, you probably see clearer correspondence between preferences and choice, and I think we have some
Hmm.
evidence of that. Um, and that's also been like a good way of I don't know, I don't know how successful I've been in this, but I've seen it as a good way of shoehorning in this more adaptationist, psychological design oriented thinking into the mating psych literature in general, right? Like, we need to stop with this sort of purely statistical approach where we're just predicting latent constructs from latent constructs, and really ask hard questions about how do we think the mind works, and
Hmm.
let those hypotheses about the design of the mind guide our predictions about people's behavior.
And what is a plausible function that the mind evolved to perform? The mind did not evolve to pick uh, dates at a speed dating uh,
Yeah, yeah,
event, right?
yeah,
It evolved in a very different context. And the decision that the mind evolved to make from an evolutionary standpoint is not, is this person, a six or above on my attractiveness meter, therefore I'm going to mate with them. It's, okay, I can only pick one person to rear offspring with, right? And they might be, a bit more attractive than usual, but a bit dumber than usual, or a bit nicer than usual, or a bit younger than I'd like, or whatever. Like there are all these considerations to make, and that is the decision that is of evolutionary relevance. That is the decision that natural selection is going to be selecting for in terms of making that decision well and effectively. It's not the decision of, are they hot enough for me? It's, is this a good choice for me to is this person a good choice for me to rear offspring with cooperatively in a way that will increase my fitness in
Mhm.
future generations? And that is a much more complicated decision to make than, is this person hot enough?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's also, I think we've neglected a lot of the people who've come at this. They're coming from sort of like social psych and cognitive psych perspectives on decision making, where you're normally studying a thing where you're the only one making a decision, right? Like
Hmm.
the decision you make is like, what brand of laundry detergent do I buy, or what car do I buy, or like what, I don't know, political party do I choose to support or something like that. But these are very unilateral decisions. Like you just get to pick what you want. But mating doesn't work that way, right? You're making the
Yeah.
choice in the context of a mating market where you have to pick a partner and also be picked back by them. And
Hmm.
so, it might not be rational to pick a partner that you don't expect to pick you back as well. And so you have
Yeah.
to consider, like, especially in a speed dating event where you're getting immediate feedback from this person, are
Yeah.
they mutually interested in you? Right. There might be partners who, in a different world, maybe you would choose, but by virtue of their preferences, you decide to go elsewhere. So you also need to consider the broader, social networks that people are embedded in, and the
Yep.
feedback systems that happen in mating market dynamics.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And
and
totally.
okay.
A whole nother set of complications, the costs of pursuing a mate that's not going to reciprocate your affections, the costs of being more into them than they are into you, or vice versa. Um, yeah, it's huge. I mean, so this brings us to another topic that you're interested in, which is your desirability as a mate. So another potential solution to this puzzle of why mate preferences don't appear to matter is that it takes two to tango, and you need the other partner to reciprocate. And perhaps the biggest mate preference of all we have is that the mate has to be into you too. That's probably the mother of all mate preferences,
Yeah,
right? If they're not into you, then the deal is off.
yeah, yeah.
So uh, the problem is, if you are not a very desirable mate, then you're going to have a very limited pool of mates to choose from. Even if you really care about hotness as your number one criteria in a mate, well, most of the hot people out there aren't willing to mate with you, and you have to choose the hottest mate you can get. So even if I really want a 10, and I say that on a questionnaire, I really want to mate with a 10, and all the 10s reject me, well, and a 3 is the hottest partner I can get. Well, there's going to be a really low correlation between my hotness preference and the mate I end up with. But that's not because it doesn't matter to me. I still would probably prefer the 3 over the 2 over the 1. It's that there are constraints in the mating market based on my desirability. So would you expect a greater correlation between preferences and outcomes among more desirable mates than among less desirable mates? And do you actually see that empirically?
I would argue you would expect that,
Yeah,
and we have evidence that that's true. We have
cool.
evidence that's true around the world. I would argue, that's a major reason to doubt the interpretations that people have drawn of these speed dating studies, but that tends to fall on deaf ears. um, I if I put my like tinfoil hat on, this is the problem. The problems we're seeing in mating psychology are just reflective of the broader problem within psychology as a whole.
Hmm.
Which Dave, you both heard me talk about this probably endlessly, but there's this blog post from 2013, I think, Denny Borsboom,
That's
which I,
great.
yeah,
Yeah.
I just adore. And he, puts a name to this issue that I hadn't heard before. I don't know if he came up with it or not, but, he says psychologists are stricken with theoretical amnesia. where like we just don't know what a scientific theory even looks like. And we end up
Yeah.
replacing scientific theories with statistical models. Like we can't see
Hmm.
the difference between a statistical model and a theoretical model. And that's so emblematic, I think, of what's happened in this mate choice literature, where people are so the whole approach has just been, I'm going to set up this linear regression model. And if preferences predict choice, then I have these data where I've collected people's preferences and I've collected the choices that they've made. If preferences predict choice, then the preference should predict the choice in this linear regression model. And I do my linear regression model and I get a p-value greater than 0.05. So therefore, preferences don't predict choice. And I think that makes a lot of sense if you don't think about it very hard. But then when you do this harder work of thinking about, well, what is the problem people are actually trying to solve? What is the problem selection has actually built us to solve? You think through like, how does the system have to work, right? What are the things, yeah, selection would design an organism to pay attention to? How would you integrate those all down into, one decision value? How would you
Hmm.
enter a market where you've got a certain amount of buying power, you have a limited number of options available to you, you've got to negotiate a match given your preferences, your affordances, their affordances, you know, how is that going to cohere into this, singular choice? I think when you think all of that through, when you build models of how all that has to work, you can see the predictions of that theoretical model are not necessarily one. You can see that linear regression model is a really impoverished picture of what's
Hmm.
happening in the world. And it's like trivial to show this theoretical model can actually predict that you wouldn't find anything in that linear regression model, right? Like if you want to see what you're looking for, you need a more complete theoretical model. But I think psychologists are not capable of seeing the relevance of that theoretical model to making predictions. They don't understand that like your predictions should come out of a theory. They shouldn't come out of a statistical model. And
And
that
Dan,
I think,
That's crazy.
yeah, and
yeah.
Dan, you're doing some of that in the computational agent-based modeling work. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the point of the agent-based models, right? The point of the agent-based models is it's a representation of the theoretical model that allows you can parameterize it with data from real people, and you can make predictions about how those real people will behave, and you can see, do their predictions line up with their real behavior? And sometimes the predictions are that, yeah, they won't choose a partner that matches what they said their preference was. But that doesn't mean that they're not acting on their preference. And that I think is a really subtle idea that's hard to get across to people who are just used to looking at correlation tables.
Right. And what are you
Yeah.
thinking about in terms of, so you're talking about the adaptive problem and the underlying psychology. There's these backwards looking issues about why this result didn't happen. As you're going forward and thinking about what is the psychology, and I know you've talked a bit about, like love, right? Or attraction. Have you either personally or in the lab or, thinking down the road, are there things that you're interested in tackling or that you've been thinking about as sort of the system and how it works that we haven't been looking at yet?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing so much work on choice. Um, I don't know that like we're right about anything.
Sure.
Uh, I think we have some, intriguing evidence. I think we've contributed helpfully, I hope, to some of these debates. And, we have models of what kind of computational object are these preferences, which I think work okay. We have models of how these preferences are integrated, yeah, into like mate value estimates, which I think work okay. We have models of sort of the psychology of attraction. How do you integrate those mate value estimates and the kind of feedback you're getting from other people to guide who you actually pursue? Those seem to work okay. Like, I think they can be improved. Hopefully, there's more work to do, and hopefully, we're like inspiring people to have more of those conversations. And I should say, I'm not doing this work alone. Like, I'm in dialogue with these people: Paul Eastwick, Tanya Gerlach, Jordan Brandner, Norm Lee, Peter Todd. Like, I think it's been a really productive debate among all of us. And I think, yeah, I'm happy with a lot of the contributions we've made so far, and I want to keep doing that. But yeah, I do want to push beyond choice increasingly, and try to get some purchase on what happens after choice. How do people make decisions about, how to behave toward their relationship partner? I mean, the way you said it before, David, is exactly right. Like it's a cooperative relationship. It's just a cooperative relationship that's focused on reproduction rather than like food production or
Yes.
other kinds of things. So how do people navigate this particular cooperative relationship? How do you decide how to behave towards your partner? How do you decide when to end a relationship, when to pursue a different relationship? I'd really, really love to study that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it feels like going out on a limb because I don't know that I have really clear ideas about how that psychology works.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, for my part, I'm shocked at the extent, at how little integration there has been between cooperation research and mating research, given that a mateship is inherently a cooperative relationship. You would think that all of the lessons we learn from cooperation and game theory would apply naturally to mating,
yeah.
not defecting in prisoners' dilemmas, detecting cheaters, contributing when the benefits outweigh the costs, calculating, are they pulling their weight? Is this a fair division of resources? All this stuff is the warp and weft of our relationships from date. Anyone who's been in a relationship knows that it is a constant, cooperative, endlessly varying, endlessly negotiated relationship.
Mhm.
And there are things being traded, there are things being offered, things being threatened to be taken away, or all this stuff comes to bear. So why hasn't cooperation been integrated with mating
And parenting too.
and parenting?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the big one. That's the whole reason why this machinery exists in the first place, is that
Yeah.
these relationships ultimately exist so that we can parent together. Why is there so little research on parenting, which is the whole point of this relationship at the end of the day?
Yeah. Yeah. I think part of it is historical artifacts, right? As we've been
Yeah,
talking about, sort of David Buss and mating research went one way, John Tooby and Lita Cosmides and cooperation research went another way.
yeah,
David was very focused on this sort of like personality psych, just map these abstract latent constructs and map relationships between these constructs, but not really digging all that deep into the psychological design. Very heavy emphasis on sex differences rather than design. And so mating people very much go into that area and they don't necessarily read as much of the cooperation stuff. Lita and John take cooperation in this very like cognitive science, very cognitive psychology, map decision rules of cooperation. And so I think just different kinds of people end up being interested in the different topics and they pick different questions. Um, and I think there is a lot to learn in mating psychology from cooperation research. And I've been really inspired by that, especially since coming to Santa Barbara, right? Like the best mate choice models we have are reciprocity models, and they look almost indistinguishable from the kinds of models you would use to model reciprocity and other kinds of cooperative exchanges. So I think
yeah.
that's going to be an obvious place to start. And I have, a new grad student starting in the fall who's interested in these questions. So I'm really hoping I can, he and I can. This is a good opportunity for both of us, maybe to dig into like how do we study relationships from this adaptationist perspective. I will say my impression, which is maybe ignorant, because again, I'm a mating guy, I'm not a cooperation guy. But my impression is a lot of the cooperation literature is very focused on relatively, how do I say this, kind of like isolated cooperative dilemmas. Like, how do you make choices in this cooperative scenario, but
Mm,
isn't as focused on relationships per se?
yeah,
So it's like, how do you have this? And that's maybe not entirely fair, but like, how do you have like a sort of, how do you navigate a repeated prisoner's dilemma kind of situation is maybe the closest you would get to like a relationship. But like a relationship is a bunch of different cooperative dilemmas
yes, yes,
all with the same person. And like, there is
yeah,
something complicated about like playing multiple games with the same person across multiple different resource types. And
yes,
what does the ledger look like when it's like, yeah, time spent parenting versus time spent, foraging versus time spent on sex and stuff like that. Like it's
yeah.
Yeah.
It's a mind fuck,
Yeah.
and it speaks again to this issue we've been bumping into, which is the clash between the complexity of reality and the crudeness of our methods.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I think there's a theme too of the history. I've always thought about like there's like a provisional EvPsych and EvPsych proper, like PEP and EP. um, and it's sort of it was this thing. Like I remember reading David's BBS paper, and I remember people being like, "Well, this is great, but you need more data." Right. And like really it was an incredible thing of that generation to provide data and even for Alita and John's work, like the cheater detection work, the domain general versus domain specific thing, that was the analog of the sex differences thing. But I oftentimes a lot of eager students will come in and they'll want to be like, well, I want to show something's domain specific. And I think like one of the things we're kind of the theme we're talking about is that the third wave sort of or this of like proper thing is, well, no, you just do a task analysis, right? It's like nobody's thought about, well, how do you model a family as a relationship or reciprocity thing? So there's no domain specific or general argument to be made. It's that you've got to come up with
right.
this de novo. It's not a measure. It's not a personality survey. It's not a Wason task. You're not reifying the measure. You're actually going adaptive problem task analysis first. And you're exactly right, Dan. I think like the incentives, the perverse incentives, and this is what the Borzman paper too is like, if you don't have data, and if you don't have a lot of papers with a lot of data, then it's really hard to be competitive. And actually, what we're arguing is that you need to like derive what you should be looking for with a task analysis. And and how would you study that is down the road from what is it you should be looking for in the first place. So no, I think like that's that theme of going from sort of a task analysis adaptive problem first, as opposed to reifying the measures or the arguments that were necessary to like make EvPsych even part of the discussion scientifically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this connects something to something you were saying earlier, David, about like these sort of early conversations, the kinds of people that they attract to the field.
Yeah.
Again, going back to Don, this is a quote that around here gets attributed to Don a lot, but I'm never actually sure what the source of this quote is. But he apparently would say that you can't understand what someone is saying unless you understand who they're arguing with. And I think if you look back at a lot of the early EvPsych work, exactly like what you're just saying, Dave, there's part of it that is sketching out what adaptationism should look like. This is what the adaptationist program for studying psychology should be. But there's another part of it that is just, you know, applying that sort of stuff in the background, but really just trying to establish the validity of this approach. And
Yeah.
so a lot of these early founders picked these particular topics, yeah, like sex differences, like domain specificity, because they were like useful points of leverage for showing that this adaptationist program was useful. And that was very successful in sort of like getting EvPsych in the door. But then I think when you have these newer generations who maybe aren't as familiar with who the interlocutors were at the time, they don't know,
Yeah.
who people were arguing with when they were proposing sex differences or proposing arguments about domain generality, domain specificity, that they miss that like, no, that was just supposed to be a useful wedge to like sneak in this adaptationist program stuff. So like we're past that now,
Yeah.
hopefully. Like enough people agree evolutionary psychology is a worthwhile thing to do. And so we need to give up on these like old dead debates and we need to just apply this like adaptationist program that people, put a lot of work into crafting and just apply it to the topics we want to study now. But I think if you weren't there for a lot of those conversations, it's easy to miss that that's what we're supposed to be doing now.
Do you think that's happening, Dan? Like applying adaptationism? I mean, do you think that that's effective, or do you think um,
I don't. I don't know. I'm a little pessimistic. I don't know. Um I think there are a lot of people who are in the field now because they just like making people angry. So they just like those arguments, they just like those debates. And so, they really just want to keep like banging the sex differences pots and pans and making as much noise as possible. Um I I, I don't know. Uh Dave, we've been recently cleaning out the physical CEP lab space, trying
Yes.
to prep for a move. And
Hmm.
it's been a trip like going through just like 30 years of nothing that ever entered that room ever left it. So there's
Mm.
just 30 years of like psych history in this physical space. We found like an old HBS program from like 1992 or something like that. And just like thumbing through the pages of that, like I think the quality of work is probably overall higher now than it was back then on a lot of dimensions. But I had the sense just from like a quick thumb through that there was much more diversity of topic
Mm.
in that older program. And there were a lot of people that were just like, I want to study this topic. Like, here's my attempt at an adaptationist approach to that topic. Um, and I feel like that doesn't happen as much at ASPES these
Yeah.
days. I think there's a much higher percentage that's just like, I'm just gonna riff off of this thing from the 90s. And many fewer people, not none. I think there's some really good work out there that really makes me hopeful for the future. But I worry that the percentage of like adaptationist approaches is decreasing over time.
Right.
I don't know what your
Hmm.
perspectives are on that.
Adaptationist as compared to what? So for those who don't know, we should briefly define adaptationism as a kind of reverse engineering approach to the mind, where you try to think about what a plausible adaptive problem would have been for our ancestors and map out what a viable solution to that problem would be, and then you make predictions based on your model of what that effective solution might look like. Very briefly, so adaptation is you have been bemoaning the decline of adaptationism.
Yeah, yeah.
What has been replacing it? What is it? What is the foil to it?
I think what it is sort of like mainstream psychology with
Hmm.
just a sort of twist of evolution. It's like
Yes. Yeah.
psych flavored LaCroix or something like that. Like,
That's
uh,
a
I'd
yeah.
buy that.
That's a
yeah,
beautiful and hideous analogy at the same time.
yeah. It's again, I don't know. I don't want to shit talk people too. Like,
Yeah.
people are doing their
No,
best.
this is the place to do it, man. This is the place where all the shit gets out.
It's just
I
us
love
three, Dan.
HBS.
It's just us three. It's just
Yeah,
us.
yeah. I love HBS. It's my favorite conference, and God bless anyone who's out there trying to do evolutionary psychology. And again, I think there are a lot of people out there really trying, but I think there are people who, again, they're just either just trying to stir controversy. They're not really trying to eliminate how the mind works. They're just trying to say things that will make people angry. And then I think there are people who are kind of just like they're just applying the sort of same statistical theoretical amnesia from like mainstream social psych or cognitive psych or developmental psych or whatever, but towards questions that historically have been of interest to evolutionary psychologists, but not even questions, like topic areas. They're taking a topic area that has been popular in evolutionary psychology and just doing mainstream psychology on it. And because
Yeah.
it's a mating topic, it sort of gets classified as evolutionary psychology. But there's no task analysis. There's not really much consideration of like what is the specific adaptive problem that you're studying here. What's your evidence that this would have been a recurrent reproductive problem throughout human evolutionary history, right? There's
Mhm.
no consideration of like what are the possible psychological designs that could actually have been good at solving this problem, and how do you know that they actually would have been good at solving this problem, and then how do those psychological designs interact with the features of the modern environment that you think are relevant to generate behavior. It's just like, well, David Buss found this sex difference in preferences, but Tinder exists now, and so nobody has asked, do these preferences also manifest on Tinder? So we looked at people's Tinder choices and looked to see if the sex differences are there. Right? There's a much higher volume of that kind of stuff and a much lower volume of like, I'm interested in, I don't know. I mean, I won't name names, but like I remember specifically showing you, Dave, in that program, some work of a person who I don't have a very high opinion of their current work. Um, and I wasn't aware of like the kind of stuff that they were doing back when
Yeah.
they were younger.
Hmm.
And I remember looking at their abstract and thinking, holy crap, like
This is
This
really
is
good.
really inventive. This
Yeah.
was like they were really swinging for the fences. They were really trying to come up with a deep adaptationist theory of, I don't even remember what the topic was. It might have been parenting. Like they're doing, they were trying to do some serious evolutionary psychology at one time. And then I don't know, they got hit in the head with a coconut and now do uh really crazy stuff. Uh Now they're a provocateur.
You got to
Um
watch it for those coconuts.
yeah. um so yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's depressing. What what are the parts of the field that give you hope to, we're starting to wrap things up or
Yeah.
drift in that direction. Be good to
Yeah.
end on a high note. What are the trends that you see as positive? Where do you see the hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think these discussions, like this focus on this debate in the mate choice area, has been really positive.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's pushed mating research in a much better direction than it was going. Um, I don't think I said Brendan Zeech's name. Brendan Zeech has also been contributing to this literature in a really nice way.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think that stuff is positive. At
He does
HBES, this is
behavioral genetics, just for people who aren't familiar, bringing behavioral genetics analysis into uh, conversation with the mating psychology literature, which I think is extremely useful.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Um, I think cooperation stuff has always been going strong, and that still goes strong. At HBES this last year, I thought HBES this last year was great. I thought it was one of the best programs I can remember in a while. I don't know how popular of an opinion that is, but like in my opinion, I thought this was an extremely strong program. Maybe too small of a program, maybe a little too restrictive. I thought the overall quality was really good. And I was like really, really impressed with the stuff coming out of like the Paris school
oh yeah, the
over
Paris
the
school rules.
fluids. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I think really inventive questions approached in a really just sober, um, dedicated adaptationist way. I was so impressed with a lot of the stuff coming out. Again, out of the like sort of Toulouse, the sort of new, there seemed to be like a kind of new approach to cultural evolution that was
Hmm.
cohering. That like a lot of talks were, Nicolas Baumar and Leo Fitucci
Hmm.
and Singh, and I think a new way of sort of bridging a sort of Santa Barbara style Boyer kind of perspective on cultural evolution with a sort of UCLA Boyd Richardson Henrik style of thinking about cultural evolution. I hope that coheres into its own sort of like perspective soon, because I was
Yeah.
just hearing things across those talks that I hadn't quite heard as like commonalities and ways people were thinking about things yet. And I think that's super exciting, and I think that's going to be really good for
Yeah.
uh, bridging a divide that I think has gotten too big and too weird. um,
Totally. And such an understudied area too. I remember, Tom Scott Phillips is another great
Mm.
yeah,
scholar
yeah,
who studies, the game theory of communication, evolution of language. And he recently, I remember him remarking at how little work there was being done on communication at
mhm,
Mm.
HBS. There's barely any work being done on communication, even
yeah,
though
Yeah.
communication is basically our superpower as a species. It's
yeah,
like the main thing we do as an animal. If we spend most of our time, I mean, HBS is itself just a bunch of communication,
yeah,
and how little we know about communication is kind of mind-boggling. It should be at the front and center of what we're doing, and it's not there. Similarly, you're talking about the Paris School. Hugo Mercier. It's a
yeah,
wonderful book, Not Born Yesterday, on our skepticism of information. You wouldn't expect us to be easily duped and easily exploited and manipulated. So we have a sophisticated information-seeking psychology that is sensitive to the costs of being manipulated and to people's competence and benevolence toward us. Fascinating stuff. He also has a theory of reasoning, where reasoning evolved in this social interactionist context, where reasoning is not just this solitary thing that we do in our heads to arrive at wisdom, but something that occurs between people, that we use reasoning to persuade other people and to justify our actions. That stuff is awesome, and yet, as far as I'm aware, he's the only one working on reasoning. As far as I'm aware, him and a handful of other people are the only ones working on our skepticism toward communicated information and what that skeptical psychology should look like. And yet these are at the center of human existence, and we know barely anything about them. So yeah, the lopsidedness of what we're focused on as a research community is kind of startling. Even within, I mean, I agree that mating should be, front and center of studies of human nature. Mating is huge. It's one of the most important things going on in our lives. And yet, even within mating, the parts of mating that we're focusing on are the least important parts of it. We're focusing on choice, right? Or attraction. The initial feelings of attraction you feel towards someone, and not, parenting, which is completely ignored, which is the whole purpose of mating, right? And yet we know nothing about parenting, and we know tons of crappy stuff about attraction in a speed dating context. That's basically so the lopsidedness of what our priorities are in terms of what to study is startling. That said, the few people who are working on reasoning and communication and epistemic vigilance, our skepticism of information, those people are doing awesome work. It's really insightful, inspiring, beautiful work. People doing work on emotions. Aaron Sell's work on anger is incredible. He recently did a guest talk at our lab at UCLA. Mind-blowing stuff. Dan Sneezer doing work on pride and shame and cross-cultural regularity. That stuff's awesome. So there is a lot of good stuff happening. I wish there were more of it, and I wish the awesome stuff was growing. But it is there.
Yeah.
Jamie Crimson friendship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent stuff on friendship and how it's not just this dyadic reciprocity relationship, but a complex dynamic where you have to figure out whether you're more loyal to me than other people, or what my relationship with you says about my relationships to other people, and thinking about friendship networks. Like, that stuff is, again, this clash between the complexity of reality and the simplicity of our methods. Jamie Crims is an excellent example of looking at the actual complexity of friendship, and we'll talk to her on our next episode. I'm excited about that. But yeah, there are stars in the darkness.
Dan,
Yeah.
Dan, I have a question. If you could wave a magic wand, how would you? What would be different, either about HBES or EvPsych or psychology?
Oh man. If I could wave a magic, I mean, part of we'll see if our symposium at HBS gets done. If I'm shopping this talk around, that is partly like, if I could wave a magic wand, I would, yeah, force all psychologists to express their hypotheses in the form of a formal adaptationist model that you need to give a logico-mathematical computational formalism for what you think is the relevant adaptive problem, and what you think are the designs that are reasonably good, improbably good at solving that problem, and how do those psychological models make predictions about the kinds of behavior people will make. So yeah, I think I would love it if not all people would agree with me, I guess, on this. We do have to be mindful in these conversations that HBS is not just evolutionary psychology. So I think, our anthropology colleagues, especially behavioral ecology colleagues, have been studying a lot of these topics like parenting that we've been neglecting.
Totally.
I think they've been rightfully annoyed at us evolutionary psychologists for being, so obsessed with like sex and dating to the exclusion of, these very big parts of human life as well.
Yeah, foraging.
Yeah. So I think it's not necessarily HBES's problem as a whole, as much as it is like the evolutionary psychologists have not been holding up their end of the bargain, maybe. So I do want to give credit to our anthropology friends for doing that. And also, so that's why part of me why I want to say like all submissions to HBES need to be explicitly adaptationist, but like I think it's fine if the behavioral ecologists and maybe even the cultural evolutionists aren't, but at least maybe you should have to say which of the three fields are you submitting in? And if you're submitting as an evolutionary psychologist, like you need to include a task analysis in your submission.
That's actually a beautiful idea. is just when you're filling out the form to submit a talk or symposium, there's just a section on task analysis, adaptive
Mhm.
problem, and you have to input those, and that's the way you submit something. I think potentially very interesting idea. Um,
Yeah, might cut submissions a bit.
that's true, or it might force people to think in terms of adaptationist, frameworks,
Yeah.
Do
which
you
might be
think
a good thing.
it's
I don't know.
Yeah, do you think it's a lack of knowledge and that if we just provide the knowledge or force people to do it in their submission uploads, but or are there perverse incentives or structural things in the way too?
I think it's a bit of both, but yeah, I think the structural issues, the perverse incentives, I think should not be understated, right? Like I think it's just you need papers, man, and it's so easy to publish a six differences paper. It's so hard to take a lot of time trying to build a really precise model of some evolutionary system. So yeah, I don't blame people, especially these days when resources in academia are especially taxed, like
Yeah.
to just
Yeah,
go
and
with
especially, yeah,
thanks so much.
I mean, the line you said that has been haunting me is that a lot of the worst psych is just psychology with an evolutionary twist,
Mhm.
like a LaCroix with evolutionary flavoring.
Yeah.
And I think, part of that comes from the fact that, we are psychologists. We have to get jobs in psychology departments. A lot of people come into EvPsych from psychology departments, and that has a way of thinking, a methodology behind it. And often it's the path of least resistance to just do psychology with an evolutionary twist. And that's the best way to get a job in a psychology department, is to do things that are recognizable to other psychologists, but have this cool twist that, sets you apart from other people. Um, so
Yeah, and I think I
yeah,
mean,
that's a big,
and I
yeah.
think there's other like obviously there's like many good people in lots of areas of psychology who are trying to get away from what's called effectology, right? And there's
Hmm.
fortunately one of the things in the theory crisis literature is this idea Iris von Rouge. I don't know how to say her last name. Apologies, but it talks about you can't just take a bunch of effects and like cobble them together. Like if you bunch like almost like a bunch of iron filings thrown into a magnetic field, that it's all going to coalesce around a theory. Like that's not. If you look across the history of sciences, that's not effects. Collecting effects is not the way things work. And so I do think the idea that you have to think about the underlying psychology and the design, whether or not people take an evolutionary approach or not, that you're getting at the underlying, the invariance you want is how the system works and what its function is. And I think people are aware of that. But yeah, I wonder, like even when I do task analyses here, like I taught a grad course this fall, um, it's very much like, there's a lot of uncertainty when you're doing a task analysis. It's very much a creative process and it's sort of brainstorming. It's sort of, well, given what are all the subproblems entailed, and just even not starving to death, what are all the systems, what are all the functions? And you can really see in students that there's a reluctance to not be wrong, to not say something that they don't already have evidence for. And I think like that's a real problem because, we're talking about, and this is Borsboom's point, is that we need theory to derive what to look for in the first place. Like Dan, I think your work is some of the most lovely in terms of doing lots of methods to derive what to look for ahead of time. And I think we've trained generations of students who don't feel like they're allowed to say what we should be looking for unless you already have data for it. And I think that sounds rigorous if you think about it for 1 second, but if you think about it for
Mhm.
longer than 1 second, it becomes it's the person looking for their keys under the light, where
Mhm.
we're trivializing the things we're looking for because we were only allowed to look for the things we already have data for. And I think that's a real structural issue of we have to let a task analysis breathe and not request data from it right away, for example, is what I think.
Yeah, and we need a healthier respect for theory in general. Um, Not just more theory, because there's lots of crappy theories in
Yeah,
psychology.
yeah.
I don't mean to like any theory, like a respect for what a good theory is.
Yeah, it's not a
Or
factor analysis. I mean, there's a place
yeah,
for organizing disparate findings, and that can be
hmm
extremely useful. But many theories, it's again this you're not allowed to theorize unless you have
hmm
data, and then it's a factor analysis. It's not deductive, it's induction. It's just sort of here's what we have evidence for, and I will just characterize the common variable or latent variable underlying these effects. I think that kind of theorizing is allowed.
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, again, I genuinely don't think a lot of psychologists are aware of what a theory is. Um, a lot of
Yeah.
what gets called theory in psychology, yeah, is either a factor analysis or yeah, it's like a string of empirical generalizations, right? Like Murray et al. 1975 found this, and Campbell et al. 1980 found that. And so, given those two observations, my hunch is you combine those two facts, you know, a third fact should be true, or what we don't know what happens if you combine those two facts. And so, here's some possibilities, but they're not, none of these are yeah, descriptions of how you think the world works grounded in some sort of broader theoretical principle. It's just either these things correlate, and so here's yeah, here's the shared variance, or it's here's three things that people have found before, and so here's how they mash together.
Yeah. Or here's an analogy to
Yeah,
to
yeah,
us. The mind is a symphony, and there can be dissonant notes. So there's cognitive dissonance, or
yeah,
the
yeah.
mind is a hydraulic system, and we need to let out steam, so there's venting, and like these kinds of glib analogies also populate our psychology in a troubling way. Anyway,
I'll even take an analogy because an analogy at least
at
like makes
least it's something.
predictions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like it has an internal logic, and if you
Yeah.
follow that logic out, it makes predictions that could be right or wrong.
Hmm.
But like
Yeah.
a path model doesn't really.
Yeah. I know most theories aren't even wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
Dan, any question that we should have asked you?
Mm. That's a great question. I should have anticipated that question.
Should we have asked you that very question?
We shouldn't. Is there any question we shouldn't have asked?
I don't know.
Or do you have a
No,
question for
maybe,
us?
this has been a great conversation. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's really nice to. This is the thing. This is also, I mean, like, this is part of the reason I'm doing this too. It's very selfish on my part too, because it's just like you really, like, day to day, you just see people and you're like, I really respect people as scientists, present company excluded. But no, no, for real. Like, I mean, I like you. I deeply respect you guys, and but then we see each other, and other things are going on, and you don't get a chance to talk about, like what are you actually thinking about and thinking deeply. And it's one of the things I love about being a scientist is that the people you get to meet and be with over time. And like both of you are a great example of like, when I see you in person, it's like no time has changed or passed, and it's just and knowing people who are sort of fellow travelers, uh, and getting to do it with people like you, it's just a real pleasure. So it's nice to be able to talk not about like the mundane stuff, but sort of about what you're thinking about. It's one of the reasons I wanted to do this.
Well, I mean, one question I could ask both of you.
Mm.
This is something I think the three of us have talked about informally, but maybe we can just sort of make it all mutual knowledge. Is like, how do you think our field's stock is doing? Are we on the rise? Are we flat? Are we going down? What's your impression?
Interesting. I have conflicting intuitions. On the one hand, I think it's undeniable that our stock has gone up in the past 30 years. Um, and, I think evolutionary psychology used to be incredibly controversial and disdained. It is now much more mainstream and accepted as a valid perspective. It's much easier to get a publication accepted in a journal with an explicitly evolutionary approach than it used to be 30 years ago. You will get way fewer adverse reactions to bringing up evolutionary psych ideas. And I think in some ways the quality has increased. We've gotten new perspectives, new methodologies, new ideas from cultural evolution, evolutionary game theory. So I think we're, in some ways, the work is getting better. It's slower than I'd like. I do think it's headed in the right direction. It's it's like a fucking sloth. I want it to pick up the pace, you know. But maybe that's just how the world works, and that's the best we can hope for is for things to slowly get better. If you look at progress in any other area of human life, it tends to be pretty slow. So maybe this is just as fast as we're gonna get, and we just gotta wait for the sloth to make its way forward. Part of me worries that maybe we're starting to decline a bit, that maybe we've I don't know, we're starting to go downhill, and that the number of people with truly adaptationist ideas is starting to decline. I don't know. That's a fear I have. What do you think,
I
uh,
mean, yeah,
Pietraszewski?
I agree that, our stock has risen considerably. I mean, I became a student, or I was interested in working with John and Lita when I was coming up into things, and there are some people who read the psychological foundations of culture. Rob Kurzban called it the standard social science straw man or something. He was like, I don't think this is like true. I really found that to be exactly the water I was swimming in as an undergrad. I mean, the what was described as the SSSM in that chapter was my undergraduate education. So for me, um, there's been quite a change uh, in in our stock in that respect. The degree to which people are just saying, oh, from an evolution perspective, and genuinely meaning like this is adding something, and it's not. There's no blink. There's no, it's just sort of without, just in passing. So I think the idea that evolution is useful, which is something that Lita famously talked about how her cognition wastes and stuff. The reviewers were like, well, you can't say that you got this idea from evolution. Lita would always say, if I had the idea like in the shower, it would have been fine. The problem wasn't the theory. The problem wasn't the data. The problem wasn't the implications about the design of the mind. The problem was the source of the hypothesis. And it was a real stretch to publish something that was premised on this is where I got the idea for it from, which is exactly what you would think in a science where you would want theory, right? Um, and so I don't think it's an accident that the theory crisis exists because, Lita, for example, and John went through that. So I think that's very different. The general idea that evolutionary approaches are helpful and useful is well understood. My opinion is there's two things that are not going great. One is what we've characterized sort of as provisional ev psych is is sort of largely what's understood. And so, as what ev psych is, so the idea of sort of, there are certain things that evolutionary psychology can tell you, but not everything is domain specific, right? Not everything is a sex difference. And so, the what sort of gets understood as what ev psych is is some things. It applies to some things, but not everything. And and then people sort of have this map then of, well, it's great, it's an overall approach, but it's not really relevant to what I study. If people understood adaptationism, if people understood task analysis, I think it would look very different in the way evolutionary psychology would be interfacing with the rest of psychology, and where it is would be very different. The way I think about it is EvPsych is answering a question that isn't largely being asked, which is sort of, what are the design features underlying a lot of these phenomena? And I think, unfortunately for EvPsych, if EvPsych had come along at a time where psychology was more asking questions about what's the underlying design features, then the relevance of the answer would have been clearer. And I think it's we're still fighting that battle. That's outside of EvPsych. But I do think people are generally okay with it. But I do think, and this coming back to this other problem of sort of people being interested in controversy, I appreciate and understand, and John and Lita talked about this a lot. People felt like it was a real personal point of courage to be able to stand up and say, I take an evolutionary approach. And there was a lot of controversy, and there were a lot of accusations about people being malicious, for taking an evolutionary approach. Um, and even why Don Simons was at UCSB apparently is because he was at Berkeley, and it wasn't appreciated that he was applying evolutionary approaches to humans. So he went down to Santa Barbara from Berkeley, which is why we're here, Dan, now, basically. Um,
You
but
know that part.
yeah, but I do worry that collecting people who are interested in controversy, does it leads to a dynamic where sometimes controversy is sort of coddled at the expense of good science. And more to the point is, I do believe we have earned social capital with respect to like other scientists, and I I do appreciate that people have different experiences, people have different political views, and people can feel really put upon and want to express, when they feel like things have been unfair or unjust. And I wouldn't question that or suggest they shouldn't be able to do that. But from an ideal perspective, one of the things I worry is when people talk about EvPsych being controversial, they're we're using up the social capital for things that are not about EvPsych. So one of the things like I worry about is people who are attracted to EvPsych and who are saying, look, we're there's not enough diversity of viewpoints in psychology. They're not talking about the lack of adaptationism in psychology. They're not talking about the lack of task analyses in psychology. And as an evolutionary psychologist, that's what I would have hoped that our social capital would have earned us, is
Yeah.
is that argument. And that's not to say other arguments should be excluded, but I think to the extent they are, that's the thing that I find really frustrating, is we're using up whatever social capital we had as a collective to make points that have nothing to do with evolutionary psychology, or if they do, they're very indirect. Um, and so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. It's a tragedy of the commons situation where we have this common resource of our credibility as a field, and people are squandering it and not using it efficiently. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think I agree with both of those perspectives.
Well, hopefully this is a little bit of light. Um, Dan, it was a pleasure to talk to you, and your lab has a website, so if people want to sort of keep up to date on your work, they should go there.
Yeah, yeah. DanConroyBeam.com.
Okay,
Find out more
Computational
about what we're doing.
Matrix Lab. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Yep,
Okay,
yep.
fantastic. Good. Well, Dan, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and maybe we'll all get together at HBES when we see each other in real life, as the kids say.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for having me. This is a really great conversation.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, man. Well, that about does it for this episode. Thank you for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please don't be shy. Leave us a kind review. Spread the word on social media. Visit our Patreon page if you want to support us. And the plan is we're going to do this again next week, right, Dave?
Yeah, that's right, David. We will do this once a week, and who knows? We'll just keep going. The sky's the limit.
Yeah. So make sure you subscribe to this podcast so you get the next one. And we'll see you next week.
Yeah, enjoy your week and be kind to yourself this week.